The engineer's fingers traced the weld line slowly. Something was wrong. Not with the tank, with everything he'd been told about American industry. April 1943. Kummersdorf, proving grounds, 20 miles south of Berlin. The tank in front of him had been pulled out of the Tunisian desert 2 months earlier. Serial number USA 3067641. The Americans called it War Daddy 2. German High Command wanted answers. They wanted to know where to shoot it. They wanted weaknesses, vulnerabilities, flaws. The engineer had spent 3 weeks tearing this machine apart, and what he found wasn't weakness. He stared at the welds again. Clean, uniform, perfect, not handcrafted, machine-made. Thousands of them, identical, flawless. The realization hit him like a shell. Germany was building masterpieces. America was printing tanks. War Daddy 2 had been abandoned on February 22, 1943, 8 days into the disaster at Kasserine Pass. Rommel's panzers had smashed through the American 1st Armored Division and sent them running. Company G, 3rd Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment lost this Sherman in the chaos. Maybe they ran dry on fuel. Maybe a track got hit. The records never said. What the records did say, German recovery crews found it intact. Engine cold, ammunition still loaded. They turned the key. It started on the first try. The Germans drove that tank 200 miles across the desert to Tunis. 4.5 days. No breakdowns, no overheating, no failures of any kind. They shipped it to Berlin. High Command wanted their best minds to crack it open. What those engineers discovered would change how they understood the entire war. Kummersdorf was the crown jewel of German weapons development. The rocket program was born there. Werner von Braun had tested his first engines on these grounds. Every major Wehrmacht weapon system, from the 88mm flak gun to the Panzer IV, had passed through its gates. The Reich's finest engineers worked inside those buildings. Men who had solved problems the rest of the world considered impossible. They had torn apart captured Soviet T-34s in 1941. The sloped armor had shocked them. They helped design the Panther as a direct response, a tank specifically built to counter Soviet engineering. Now they had their first American medium tank, and unlike the T-34, they expected this one to be a joke. German intelligence had dismissed the Sherman as a crude, mass-produced box. Thin armor, weak gun, built by a nation with zero tank warfare experience. The engineers approached it like master craftsmen examining a cheap counterfeit. They expected sloppy welds, brittle steel, amateur construction. They had their pens ready to write a report that would make the generals smile. They started with the armor, measured every plate, calculated every angle, stenciled the numbers in white paint directly onto the hull. 51 millimeters on the front, 38 on the sides. A tiger could punch through it from over a mile away. Nothing impressive, not yet. Then they opened the engine bay. The Continental R975 sat in the rear hull like it had been dropped in from an airplane, because it had. The Americans took a proven aircraft radial engine and bolted it into a tank. 400 horsepower, air-cooled, designed to run at altitude where no mechanic could reach it. The Germans calculated the power-to-weight ratio. Sherman, 30 tons, 13 horsepower per ton. Panther, 45 tons, 700 horsepower engine, but only 15.5 horsepower per ton. The smaller American tank was almost as nimble as the German heavyweight, But power wasn't the revelation. Any nation could build a strong engine. What stunned them was the access. Every major component sat behind large hatches. Oil changes took minutes. Spark plugs came out without special tools. A mechanic with basic training could keep this engine running forever. German tank engines required factory-trained specialists. The Maybach HL-230 in the Panther had chronic overheating problems that caused fires. Replacing one meant a crane and an entire day's work. The Americans had built a tank any soldier could fix in the field. The Germans had built machines that needed to be shipped back to factories. Then came the transmission test. The engineers fired up the drivetrain and waited for the familiar sound. The grinding scream of spur gears fighting friction. Every German tank made that noise. The Sherman hummed. One engineer called his colleagues over. They stood around the tank in silence, listening. Herringbone gears. Precision-cut helical teeth that meshed smoothly under load. The kind of gears that lasted thousands of miles without wearing down. German tanks used straight-cut spur gears, cheaper to manufacture, but they wore out fast under combat stress. The reason was simple. Herringbone gears required tungsten carbide tooling that Allied blockades had cut off. Germany couldn't build them even if they wanted to. The Sherman's transmission could survive 3,000 miles before needing overhaul. The Panther's final drive averaged around 100 miles. Not 100,000, 100. A Sherman could drive from Normandy to Berlin under its own power. A Panther could barely make it from the rail yard to the front. The engineers kept digging, and it kept getting worse. Mounted on the 75mm gun, a small electrical box, cables running to a gyroscope near the gunner's seat, a gun stabilizer. The Americans had installed gyroscopic stabilization in a mass-produced tank. German engineers had experimented with stabilizers for years. They never managed to miniaturize the components enough. The precision required was beyond their manufacturing capability. The Westinghouse system wasn't perfect. It only worked in the vertical plane. But it kept the gun roughly on target while the tank moved. The gunner could fire accurately within seconds of stopping. German tanks needed 10 to 15 seconds for their suspensions to settle before the gunner could aim properly. In a tank duel, the first accurate shot wins. The Sherman could fire before a German tank stopped bouncing. The engineers ran the calculations. Could they replicate this system? The answer, no. Not with their current factories. Not with available materials. Not with anything they had. June 1943. War Daddy 2 was shipped to Hillersleben for a demonstration before High Command. This wasn't a technical evaluation anymore. This was theater. Senior officers from across the Wehrmacht gathered to watch. Generals who controlled armored production budgets. Men who would decide whether to keep building Tigers and Panthers, or admit that something needed to change. They set up a climbing test. A steep 30-degree slope of loose sand. The kind of terrain that separated real fighting machines from paper designs. The Panther went first. It roared up the hill effortlessly, wide tracks biting into the sand, engine never straining. The generals nodded approvingly. Then came War Daddy 2. Its narrower rubber block tracks, designed for roads, not dunes, slipped on the loose surface. The engine whined, the tracks spun, the tank slid backward. The Sherman failed. The generals applauded. But one man in the audience wasn't clapping. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, the most powerful industrial figure in Nazi Germany. He controlled every tank, aircraft, submarine, and rifle the Reich produced. He had tripled weapons output in 1942 through sheer organizational brilliance, consolidating factories, eliminating redundancies, forcing competing agencies to cooperate. He genuinely believed German engineering could outproduce the Allies if properly managed. He was about to discover he was wrong. Photographs exist of Speer examining War Daddy 2. He studied the reports. He spoke to the engineers, and he reached a conclusion that would haunt him until his death. Speer later wrote that the Sherman's cross-country mobility had impressed observers in Italy. It climbed mountains German experts deemed impassable for armor. But Speer understood the deeper problem. Germany was building complex machines that required dedicated rail networks to move. America was building a mobile force that could drive itself to the front lines. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a philosophy. American industrial philosophy prioritized three things: reliability, maintainability, mass production. German industrial philosophy prioritized 1. Technical superiority. The Americans accepted trade-offs gladly. A less powerful gun, because the 75mm was reliable and ammunition was plentiful. Thinner armor, because it reduced weight and improved mobility. Simpler design, because it meant faster production and easier repairs. Every choice pointed the same direction: get more working tanks to the front, keep them running longer. Germany couldn't match that. Not because their engineers weren't brilliant. They were among the finest in the world, because they had optimized for the wrong things. They built weapons designed to win battles. America built weapons designed to win wars. The men who understood this best weren't engineers. They were tank crews, the ones who lived and died based on whether their machines worked. Alfred Rubbel commanded a Tiger I in the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion. 57 confirmed kills. One of Germany's greatest tank aces. A man who had destroyed entire columns of enemy armor. His unit used captured Shermans for recovery and resupply, because the American tanks were more reliable than their own. Rubbel later compared the Sherman to a reliable civilian car. You pushed the button and it started. With the Tiger, there was always a procedure: checking fluids, warming up, worrying about the transmission, praying it wouldn't break before you reached the battle. The Sherman just worked. Every time. Without drama. By 1944, German armored divisions reported operational readiness rates between 35 and 45%. More than half their tanks were broken down at any given time. American units maintained readiness above 85%. When they needed tanks, they had tanks. The Normandy campaign proved everything the Kummersdorf engineers had feared. During the retreat from France, roughly half of all abandoned Panthers had been destroyed by their own crews. Not from combat damage, from mechanical failure. German tankers blew up their own machines because the transmissions had died. Imagine the frustration. You have the most powerful gun on the battlefield, the thickest armor, and you're standing on the side of a road in France, watching your transmission smoke while a column of inferior Shermans drives past you to win the war. They didn't lose because they were outfought. They lost because they couldn't get to the fight. The statistics from the Bulge were worse. By late 1944, 60 to 70% of German heavy tank losses were non-combat related. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, not American guns, German engineering. America built 49,234 Sherman tanks during the war. Germany built roughly 6,000 Panthers and 1,347 Tigers. The ratio was nearly 8-1, and American tanks actually worked when they reached the front. A Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans in a single engagement. But 6 more would arrive tomorrow, and the Tiger would still be waiting for a transmission that wouldn't come for 3 weeks. The mathematics were brutal. German tankers achieved kill ratios that would have won any other war. But this war wasn't about kill ratios. It was about logistics. War Daddy 2 had shown the German engineers exactly why they would lose. A tank that started when you pushed the button. A transmission that outlasted the war. An engine any mechanic could fix. The engineers wrote their reports. They documented every advantage. They explained exactly why American mass production would win the logistics war. Nobody listened. The generals had watched the Sherman slide backward on a sandy hill and walked away convinced German engineering was superior. Germany kept building Tigers and Panthers, magnificent machines that spent more time broken than fighting. Technical marvels that couldn't compete with American quantity and reliability. Beautiful engineering trapped inside an ideology that demanded perfection over practicality. The Kummersdorf engineers had seen the future in April 1943. They had written it down. They had tried to warn anyone who would listen. 2 years later, that future rolled across the Rhine on American tracks. Reliability beats perfection. Availability beats capability. Working beats superior every single time. That was the lesson hidden inside War Daddy 2. Germany never learned it, and by the time they understood why it mattered, the war was already over.